On the morning of 26 of March 1968, 3 years after the cancellation, a member of Parliament rose in the House of Commons and asked a very specific question. Which official was personally responsible for ordering the total destruction of all jigs, tools and prototypes of the TSR-2 aircraft? Parliament recorded the question. Parliament never produced a clean answer. That absence is what this script is about. The TSR-2 wasn't killed at the drawing board, it flew. One example of it, serial number XR219, painted in anti-flash white, lifted off the runway at the Aeroplane and Armament experimental establishment at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire on 27th of September 1964 and flew for approximately 15 minutes before returning. BAC's chief test pilot called it pleasant to fly. Over the following 6 months, it completed 23 more flights, reached Mach 1.12 in level flight, and demonstrated what its designers had promised, that the aircraft had, in the words of the pilot himself, no aspects of stability and control needing major attention or modification. Then the government cancelled it. Then, separately, someone ordered it destroyed. Then, when pressed, no one admitted giving that second order. That sequence, flight, cancellation, destruction, silence, is the argument. The cancellation was policy, the destruction was intent. To understand what Britain chose to unmake, you need to start not with the aircraft, but with the problem it was born to solve. In 1951, Britain introduced the English electric Canberra jet bomber. Fast for its time, high-flying, genuinely capable. The design was so effective that the United States licensed it for production, one of the very few cases where that happened in reverse. The Canberra entered service as Britain's most capable strike platform. By the mid-1950s, it was already obsolete. The Soviet Union had introduced the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile, which shot down a Taiwanese RB-57 reconnaissance aircraft in 1959. The Canberra, designed for medium to high-altitude flight, couldn't survive in airspace defended by these weapons. The solution was to go low. Below radar horizon, below the engagement envelope of contemporary SAMs, down to 200 feet above the ground, faster than any existing platform had flown at that altitude. Since radar operates in line of sight, and the curvature of the Earth renders low-flying aircraft invisible beyond a certain range, a fast jet at treetop height was, in theory, nearly impossible to intercept. In November 1956, the Air Ministry issued General Operational Requirement 339, GOR 339, for a Canberra successor. The requirement was ambitious to the point of being almost provocative. Supersonic penetration capability, all-weather operation, nuclear weapons delivery, short-field takeoff from dispersed grass strips, and the ability to operate at Mach 1.1 at 200 feet above the ground. Only one company in Britain had real experience with supersonic aircraft at that point. English Electric, which had built the Lightning, teamed with Vickers Armstrongs to bid. In January 1959, they were selected as joint contractors. Before the first piece of the new aircraft had been cut, it was already under political siege. In March 1957, the same month GOR 339 was formally distributed to industry, Defence Minister Duncan Sandys published Command Paper No. 124, the 1957 Defence White Paper. Its central argument: ballistic missiles were the weapons of the future. Manned combat aircraft would have little utility in airspace dominated by surface-to-air missiles, and the era of the piloted interceptor was essentially over. The paper cancelled the Avro 730 supersonic bomber, the Saunders-Roe SR-177 interceptor, and the Blue Envoy SAM program. The English Electric P1, which became the Lightning, survived as the sole exception, and only after senior RAF officers argued strenuously that the incoming Tupolev Tu-22 supersonic bomber made a manned interceptor unavoidable. Virtually every other advanced manned aircraft program then in development was ended. Sands also used the white paper to force the aircraft industry to merge. New contracts would only go to consolidated firms. Under that pressure, English Electric, Vickers Armstrongs, Bristol Aircraft and Hunting Aircraft came together in 1960 to form the British Aircraft Corporation, BAC. Not a start-up. The forced consolidation of the companies that had built the Canberra, the Valiant, the Britannia and the Lightning. This was the concentrated remainder of British military aviation, assembled under government direction, and TSR-2 was its first major military program. Roland Beaumont, speaking at the Royal Air Force Historical Society's 1998 seminar, described the post-1957 period as one of confusion and indecision in the field of military aircraft procurement, where momentum in continuous development had been lost. He had watched his industry absorb the white paper's logic, watched the forced mergers produce administrative complexity that would haunt the TSR-2 program from its first day, and he had gone on building the aircraft anyway. The TSR-2 survived Sandy's cull only because its mission profile, low-level, high-speed, terrain-following penetration, described something that missiles genuinely couldn't do. As Conservative MP Julian Amery wrote in the Sunday Telegraph in 1965, "There are jobs that missiles can't do. They can't reconnoitre enemy positions, they can't be moved rapidly from one theatre to another, nor can they be switched from one target to another. Only a manned vehicle can produce such flexibility." That logic kept the program alive. It didn't make it safe. The aircraft that emerged from BAC's joint design teams at Warton and Weybridge was specified to be the most technically advanced strike platform Britain had ever attempted. Its design envelope called for a dash speed of Mach 2.35 at altitude, constrained by airframe heating rather than thrust limits, and a low-level cruise of Mach 0.9 at 200 feet above the ground. At that speed and altitude, in certain modes of operation, the pilot wouldn't be flying in any conventional sense. A system built by Ferranti in Edinburgh would be. Ferranti's monopulse terrain-following radar was, by the accounts in the historical record, the first terrain-following radar specifically designed for any aircraft. Built in production form from 1959 and first tested on an English Electric Canberra testbed from the winter of 1961 and 1962. Ferranti had won the contract sometime in 1957 or 1958, partly because the company already understood monopulse radar from its work on the Lightning's air-pass fire control system. All that changed for terrain following was rotating the antenna from horizontal to vertical measurement. The system worked like this. A pencil beam radar scanned vertically ahead of the aircraft, comparing the returns against a pre-computed maneuvering curve, a ski ramp profile representing the path the aircraft would need to fly to clear terrain at maximum maneuvering load. Discrepancies between the actual terrain and the ideal curve generated correction commands fed directly to an Elliott dual-channel autopilot. The aircraft would rise and fall over hills, valleys and ridgelines automatically, maintaining a selected clearance height. During Ferranti's testbed trials, pilots flew the system down to a 30-metre average clearance over rough terrain, including mountain ridges and cliff faces. They tested it against overhead power lines, bridge spans across the River Forth, and radio antennas at Cairn-o-Mount. The more they flew it, the further they reduced the clearance setting. This is a meaningful technical distinction. The General Dynamics F-111, which Britain would eventually order as a TSR-2 substitute, was initially equipped with a terrain avoidance radar, a system that mapped obstacles horizontally and presented them to the navigator as a display. The crew then chose a route around higher ground. The Texas Instruments AN/APQ-110 that replaced it, a true terrain-following system, entered service on the F-111 in 1967, roughly 3 to 4 years after TSR-2's first flight. Britain was first to design and build a terrain-following radar for a strike aircraft, but the gap in actual service fielding was years, not decades. The more important point for the history of what was destroyed is different. The Ferranti TFR on TSR-2 was never flight tested in the aircraft's integrated configuration before cancellation. It flew on test beds. What XR-219 was flying toward, in 6 months of careful test program expansion, was the full integration of that radar with the aircraft's own autopilot and NavAttack suite. That suite was also specified as a first-of-its-kind system. Navigation and attack depended on a Smiths Industries air data computer, a Ferranti inertial navigation platform, and a Decca Doppler system for precision velocity updates, fed into a digital computer architecture that processed strike mission data automatically. 4 onboard computers. Weapons delivery solutions computed in flight. All-weather, day-night strike capability designed into the airframe from the start. None of this was proven in integrated flight before April 1965. All of it had been proven in components and on test beds. The test program, at 24 flights, had covered basic handling, engine performance, and initial envelope expansion. 2,500 hours of testing remained before the aircraft could enter service. Beaumont, with characteristic directness, said those 24 flights had already shown there was no reason to believe the remaining hours would produce anything irredeemable. Cancelling at that point was financially defensible if you accepted the cost argument. Destroying the hardware so it could never be returned to wasn't required by the finances. It was required by something else. At 3:28 in the afternoon on 27 September 1964, XR-219 left the runway at Boscombe Down. Contemporary press coverage the following morning described the flight as marking both an aeronautical achievement and the outgoing Conservative government's last major political act, noting that what remained was for the incoming government to prove the aircraft had the strategic value claimed for it, bring it through to RAF squadron service, and deal with the bill from the British Aircraft Corporation. The aircraft was painted in anti-flash white, the same flat, chalky livery worn by Britain's nuclear V-bombers. Not a test colour, a declaration of role. In afternoon light over Wiltshire, with a black Canberra and a lightning escort falling into watchful formation alongside, the white delta-winged prototype would have been visible for miles. At the controls was Wing Commander Roland Prosper Beaumont, known throughout the industry as B, BAC's chief test pilot. Beaumont had spent the war flying Hawker Hurricanes with No. 87 Squadron in the Battle of France and Battle of Britain, then transferred to Hawker Typhoons, commanding No. 609 Squadron on low-level intruder and ground attack operations against trains and airfields across occupied Europe. He had accumulated more than 500 operational sorties, personally destroyed approximately 31 V-1 flying bombs in air-to-air intercepts during the summer of 1944, and was shot down by ground fire in a Hawker Tempest on the 12th of October that year. Prisoner of war until the end of the conflict. He left the RAF and became English Electric's chief test pilot. He performed the first flight of the Canberra in May 1949. He was the first British pilot to exceed Mach 1 in level flight in a British aircraft, in the P-1A prototype WG-760 in August 1954. In November 1958, he took the English Electric Lightning to Mach 2. Beaumont in 1964 wasn't a junior test pilot, proving a marginal prototype. He was the most credentialed man in Britain for the task. Someone who had already built two of the aircraft TSR-2 was designed to replace and exceed. In the rear cockpit sat Donald Bowen, observer and navigator. The flight was conservative by design. XR-219's undercarriage was left down and locked throughout. It had not been cleared for retraction. Speed was capped at approximately 250 knots. Altitude around 10,000 feet. The aircraft made a wide circuit, twin vortices appearing at the wingtips, the flames of the reheated Olympus exhausts replaced by a sooty trail. The orange landing parachute bursting from its tail on approach. Beaumont and Bowen emerged with empty snag sheets and told the assembled BAC engineers they could safely have turned around and flown the aircraft again straight away. 18 days later, the government that had funded it would cease to exist. On the 15th of October 1964, Harold Wilson's Labour Party won the British general election. The majority, 4 seats. Wilson became Prime Minister. Dennis Healey was appointed Secretary of State for Defence, and he would remain there until June 1970. The incoming government had, during the campaign, given assurances to workers at BAC's facilities near Preston and Wharton that jobs and the programme were safe under Labour. A majority of 4 is a political fact that changes everything about how decisions get made. With the slimmest possible working majority, the Wilson government couldn't afford to own programmes that had acquired serious opposition from the Treasury, from other services, or from within the party itself. Every expensive commitment was a potential ambush. The TSR-2 was both expensive and contested. Its cost projections had risen significantly from original estimates. The Royal Navy had been actively hostile to a programme whose proponents argued it could replace carrier aviation entirely, and the chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Defence, Sir Solly Zuckerman, had long advocated buying American rather than building British. The programme had enemies in almost every direction that mattered. Wilson called a second election in March 1966, specifically to achieve a mandate larger than the 4-seat majority he had inherited. That detail tells you how he experienced his first 18 months in office. Perpetually exposed, perpetually one vote from collapse. Every decision made in that period was made by a government acutely conscious of how little margin it had. On the 31st of March 1965, XR-219 completed its 24th and final test flight, having accumulated approximately 13 hours of flying time. Flight 14, on the 22nd of February 1965, had been the only supersonic flight the programme ever made. Beaumont had taken the aircraft smoothly through to approximately Mach 1.12 on a ferry flight to Wharton. The flight test programme had proven basic handling and structural integrity across the available envelope. 2,500 hours remained before the aircraft could enter service. On the 6th of April 1965, Chancellor James Callaghan announced the cancellation in his budget speech. That same morning, BAC test pilot Jimmy Dell was seated in the cockpit of XR-220, the second prototype, with a maiden flight scheduled for that day. He heard the announcement. XR-220 never flew. The cancellation was the Cabinet's decision, taken on the 1st of April 1965 by Harold Wilson's government on cost grounds. That is documented and uncontested. What followed is where the record becomes disputed, and the dispute is the point. At BAC's Warton factory in Lancashire, a full-scale wooden mock-up of the TSR-2 was burned. BAC personnel filmed it. At the Brooklands site in Surrey, the former Vickers Armstrong's facility, tooling jigs and many part-completed airframes were scrapped within approximately 6 months of the cancellation. Large steel assemblies cut apart so they couldn't be reassembled. Engineers at BAC reportedly received instructions on the day of the announcement to take program drawings outside and burn them in metal bins. One first-hand account describes watching all the jigs and drawings disappear with what struck him as remarkable speed. The documented disposal trail is extensive. XR-224, XR-225 and XR-226, completed airframes that had never flown, went to a scrap merchant, R.J. Coley & Son, in Hounslow, Middlesex. XR-219, XR-221 and XR-223 were delivered on the 14th of August 1966 to the Proof and Experimental Establishment at Shoeburyness on the Essex coast for vulnerability and lethality trials. That is, they were used as weapons targets. XR-219, the only TSR-2 that ever flew, was eventually scrapped there around 1982. XR-221 and XR-223 followed in the early 1970s. Concrete formers used to shape skin panels survived at the Brooklands site as discarded blocks. Nothing that could support production was preserved. 2 airframes survived. XR-221, the aircraft Dell had been sitting in, was kept for engine noise testing at Boscombe Down, then stored and eventually transferred to the RAF Museum at Cosford. XR-222, a 4th prototype never completed to flight standard, went to the College of Aeronautics at Cranfield in 1965 and was transferred to the Imperial War Museum at Duxford in 1978. Both exist. Neither is airworthy. Neither can ever be made airworthy because the jigs that produced their components no longer exist. They didn't get everything. The survival of 2 shells is part of what makes the destruction story precise rather than mythological. You can go and see what they left. Damien Burke's reference work on the program, TSR-2, Britain's Lost Bomber, runs to 351 pages and was produced using documentation that was retained somewhere. A master file of drawings was reportedly preserved. The destruction was extensive, it wasn't total. But the specific physical prerequisites for reversal, the production tooling, the integrated avionics testbeds, the airworthy flying hardware, were gone. What survived was archival. What was destroyed was operational. The RAF Historical Society's 1998 seminar volume, the most authoritative retrospective account of the program, assembling contributors who had been directly involved at every level, states that the Minister of Aviation gave instructions to break up the existing completed and incomplete TSR-2s. The Minister of Aviation in April 1965 was Roy Jenkins, but specialist program histories offer a more diffuse picture. Not a single, all-encompassing destruction order, but a sequence of administrative decisions, jigs initially preserved at ministry request and then disposed of within a year, airframes routed to trials rather than storage, documentation managed selectively. One account frames it as an enduring myth that a single destruction order was issued, arguing that what happened was the management of program closedown through multiple acts by multiple officials. A parliamentary account suggests a named official within the bureaucracy ordered that a master set of drawings be kept, a detail it describes as having been confirmed in Parliament. What Parliament itself confirmed is different and more revealing. On the 26th of March 1968, an MP asked in the Commons which official was personally responsible for ordering the total destruction of all jigs, tools and prototypes. The question is in Hansard. A clean parliamentary answer identifying a named individual isn't. 6 weeks later, another MP asked what the jigs and tools had been worth when scrapped in 1965. The destruction was a stated parliamentary fact. Its single author was never established on the record.
Denis Healey's documented public statements address the cancellation. He defended it repeatedly on cost grounds, writing in his autobiography that the TSR-2 cost far more than private estimates had suggested. His public record is largely silent on the question of the physical destruction specifically. The RAF Historical Society points toward Jenkins at the Ministry of Aviation. Specialist histories describe sequential decisions rather than one named command. Forum discussions cite what purports to be a Healey statement to the effect that he didn't know who had ordered the jig destruction. But this can't be traced to a clearly documented primary source and can't be stated as verified. Nobody owns the destroy order. That is the finding. The cancellation was defensible as policy under financial pressure. The physical destruction was a further act, and the author of that further act remains, more than 60 years later, bitterly disputed. The political logic of that silence isn't difficult to read. When Healey presented the Cabinet with the cancellation recommendation, he was explicit about one thing. He told the Cabinet that without simultaneously announcing a satisfactory option on a replacement aircraft, he couldn't justify the cancellation to Parliament, to the country, or to the services. The replacement was the General Dynamics F-111, a comparable swing-wing, low-level strike aircraft then in development for the US Air Force. Britain agreed to seek an option on up to 110 F-111 aircraft. An adapted version for British requirements, designated F-111K, was eventually ordered in February 1967, 50 aircraft. On the 16th of January 1968, the F-111K was cancelled. Harold Wilson's government. Denis Healey still at defence. The devaluation of sterling in November 1967 had raised the per-unit cost substantially, making the order financially untenable. By March 1968, Healey was at the dispatch box in the Commons discussing cancellation payments still to be negotiated over the abandoned order. The RAF received 46 Buccaneer S-2B aircraft beginning in 1969. The Buccaneer was a capable platform, a low-level maritime strike aircraft designed by Blackburn in the 1950s, in Royal Navy service since 1962, and eventually respected by the RAF pilots who flew it. It was subsonic. Its nav attack systems were considerably less integrated than what TSR-2 had been designed to carry. Seppercat Jaguar entered RAF service from 1974 as a tactical strike aircraft. The Panavia Tornado GR-1, developed through a European consortium, began entering RAF service in the late 1970s and was declared operational in the early 1980s. The logic of the cancellation in 1965 had been presented as a trade. Britain would destroy the aircraft it had built and acquire a capable American substitute at lower cost. That trade wasn't delivered. Britain destroyed the aircraft it had, couldn't afford the replacement, and equipped its strike pilots with the Buccaneer, an aircraft the RAF had explicitly rejected as inadequate for this exact mission role back in 1957. The same aircraft, 8 years later, by necessity.
In February 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, RAF Tornado GR-1 aircraft flew precision strike missions over Iraq carrying TSR-2, the Thermal Imaging Airborne Laser Designator Pod. TSR-2 was the RAF's first fully operational airborne laser designation system. The RAF's own Air Historical Branch study of the Gulf War notes that TSR-2 was the only airborne designator left available to the RAF, with pods originally intended for the Tornado having to be shared with Harrier aircraft to meet demand. It was, in February 1991, a scarce asset. The TSR-2 was cancelled in April 1965. TSR-2 entered operational service in February 1991. 26 years. The Buccaneer received the American Pave Spike Laser Designator Pod in 1979, providing some precision designation capability in the decade before TSR-2. The gap between 1965 and 1991 isn't a complete absence of all-strike capability. The RAF flew and fought with what it had, and some of what it had was genuinely effective. But the specific combination that TSR-2 was designed to deliver, automatic terrain-following penetration at high speed, integrated precision nav attack, all-weather day-night capability built into the airframe from the start, wasn't available in RAF service until the TSR-2-equipped Tornado of 1991. An entire career span of RAF strike pilots trained, flew operationally, and in several cases flew in conflicts without the capability the government had already built and chosen to destroy. The capability gap ran from April 1965 to February 1991. 26 years isn't an approximation. It's the interval between the cancellation date and the first documented operational use of a comparable integrated capability by an RAF aircraft in combat. Britain wasn't alone in making this kind of choice. Canada cancelled the Avro CF-105 Arrow, an advanced supersonic interceptor that had made successful test flights, on the 20th of February 1959. 2 months after the announcement, the Canadian government ordered the assembly line, tooling, plans, airframes and engines destroyed. The pattern is the same. Advanced domestic program, cancellation after successful flight, physical destruction of the hardware to prevent reversal. It has the quality of a shared habit among Cold War allies. The distinction in the TSR-2 case is what came after the destruction. Canada's Arrow cancellation left the RCAF equipped with different aircraft. Britain cancelled the TSR-2, destroyed it to prevent reversal, ordered the American replacement, and then cancelled that too. The destruction achieved only permanence. It didn't achieve the affordable alternative it was supposed to purchase. In the RAF Historical Society's 1998 seminar, Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Michael Beetham, who had been involved in the programme's origins since its earliest days, said that the cancellation of TSR-2 left a gap that was never satisfactorily filled. He had helped shape the requirement. He watched the aircraft cancelled before it could meet it. He sat at the seminar 32 years later and said the gap had never been filled. Beaumont, in his introduction to the same volume, described the cancellation as the programme's assassination. Not its failure, not its natural end, its killing. He noted that from basic low speed to high speed at low level and to transonic at altitude, the aircraft had demonstrated no aspects needing major attention. Its control qualities were already superb. He said this was an astounding advance for so early in a flight development program. He said its cancellation couldn't have been justified on any viable technical grounds. No official who voted for the cancellation disputed that technical assessment publicly. The argument was always cost. Cost arguments don't require you to burn the evidence. They don't require you to route prototypes to weapons ranges rather than museums. They don't require you to cut the tooling so it can never be reused. Those choices go beyond the requirements of financial management. They describe a deliberate act of making reversal impossible, and then, when asked who decided to make reversal impossible, producing no answer. What you are left with is this. Britain flew the TSR-2 on the 27th of September 1964. It was designed to penetrate defended airspace at low level using a terrain-following system Ferranti had been building since 1959, the first such radar specifically engineered for a strike aircraft. Specified to reach Mach 2.35 at altitude and to cruise at Mach 0.9 at 200 feet, running the terrain automatically on a system tested to 30 meters clearance over mountain ridges. Carrying a fully integrated nav attack architecture using inertial navigation, Doppler velocity updates, and 4 digital computers processing strike data in flight. After 24 flights, the Wilson government cancelled it. After the cancellation, completed airframes went to a scrap merchant in Hounslow and to a weapons range in Essex. Tooling jigs were cut apart at Brooklands. The wooden mock-up was burned at Wharton. Engineers reportedly destroyed their own drawings in metal bins on the day of the announcement. The Hansard record shows Parliament asked 3 years later who gave the destruction order. No conclusive answer came. The RAF Historical Society's account points toward the Minister of Aviation. Specialist histories describe sequential administrative decisions rather than a single command. Dennis Healy's documented record addresses the cancellation, not the destruction. The government that destroyed the aircraft then ordered 50 F-111K aircraft to replace it. On 16th of January 1968, that order was also cancelled. From April 1965 to February 1991, the RAF flew without the integrated capability the TSR-2 had been built to provide. 26 years. 2 airframes survive, XR-220 at Cosford, XR-222 at Duxford. Stripped, static, cosmetically restored, permanently grounded. They are what physical destruction looks like when it almost works. Everything that could make them fly again is gone. The crime wasn't the cancellation. Cancellations happen. Governments run out of money, change priorities, make bad trades. The crime was the decision to make cancellation permanent, to destroy the physical capability so thoroughly that no future government could revisit the choice. And then to cancel the substitute too, having already made the original irretrievable. The question Parliament asked in 1968 was the right one. The fact that nobody could cleanly answer it tells you exactly what kind of decision it was. Subscribe for more stories like this.